The whole town laughed when he built it, and now they know why. An aging veteran in a red and black flannel jacket settled on the edge of a frozen Michigan town, choosing a half-buried metal cabin when winter was closing in fast. Neighbors called it stupid, a death trap, a mistake he wouldn't survive. But when the coldest winter in decades arrived, and every log cabin around him began to freeze, his loyal German shepherd refused to leave his side. And inside that strange metal shelter, something happened no one could explain. What they discovered during that brutal winter would silence every critic, rewrite what people believed about survival, and turn a laughingstock into a legend. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Winter crept over Marquette, Michigan, like a slow, deliberate verdict. The kind delivered without anger, but without mercy, as Lake Superior exhaled cold air that cut through wool, wood, and bone alike. Thomas Walker returned to the city on a gray afternoon when the sky hung low and heavy, the clouds packed tight as if conserving their strength for what was coming. He walked with the careful, economical steps of a man who had learned long ago how to move when every ounce of energy mattered. At 67, his frame was still broad, shoulders squared by decades of military discipline, though age had pulled them slightly forward, as if memory itself carried weight. A thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket wrapped his torso, faded at the elbows, stiffened by years of smoke and weather. Beneath it, his hands were large, scarred, the knuckles permanently thickened, fingers bearing the fine tremor of old injuries that never truly healed. His face was deeply lined, with sharp cheekbones and a jaw that still held its edge, though gray stubble shadowed it constantly. His eyes, pale and watchful, had the look of a man who measured rooms instinctively, noting exits, angles, weaknesses, habits left over from a life that had taught him not to trust quiet. At his side moved Shadow, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick gray-black coat and amber eyes that never stopped scanning. Shadow's ears were always half-tilted forward, alert even when at rest, his movements smooth and deliberate. He stayed close to Thomas's left knee, close enough that his shoulder brushed the man's leg when the wind gusted hard. The dog had been assigned to Thomas years earlier during his last deployment overseas, trained for patrol and detection, but somewhere between dust storms and long nights, Shadow had become less a tool and more a witness. When Thomas was discharged and the world shrank back into civilian shapes, Shadow followed him without question. Marquette had changed less than Thomas expected. The buildings were older now, paint peeling more openly, but the rhythms were the same. The dock cranes along the harbor, the sawmill trucks rumbling through town, the winter faces already closing in on themselves. People noticed Thomas immediately. A returning veteran always drew attention, especially one who did not smile easily and wore his history like a second coat. Some nodded politely. Others stared just long enough to recognize that he was not a man to be questioned. Thomas owned a narrow strip of land at the edge of town, where the pine forest thickened and the wind ran faster. It wasn't much, just enough to keep the trees from pressing too close, enough to see the lake on clear days. When the truck delivering the metal panels arrived, people slowed their cars to watch. Corrugated steel ribs slid onto the frozen ground, half-cylinders glinting dully beneath the clouded sun. Someone laughed. Another shook his head. This was not how cabins were built here. Howard Miller was the first to speak up, leaning against his pickup with his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. He was a third-generation local, thick-necked, broad-bellied, with a red beard that froze white at the tips each winter. "That thing's a tin coffin," he said to no one in particular. "You bury yourself in that come January, you won't be coming out." Thomas heard him. He heard all of them. He simply nodded once as if acknowledging the weather forecast, and kept working. Shadow circled the perimeter, nose close to the ground, paws crunching through frost-hardened soil. To the town, the structure looked absurd. A curved metal shell, partially sunk into the earth, its lower half swallowed by soil. Thomas shoveled himself, load after load, until his breath burned and his shoulders screamed. They called it a submarine, a soup can, a panic shelter. Someone said it looked like he was hiding from the government. Another joked that the wind would peel it open like a sardine tin. Laughter traveled fast in Marquette when winter approached. Fear always needed a voice. Inside Thomas's mind, the noise of their mockery faded beneath older sounds. The scream of wind across Alaskan runways, engines coughing under ice-thick oil. The memory of nights when heat meant survival, not comfort. He remembered how metal betrayed warmth unless you taught it not to, how mass mattered more than flame, how the earth itself was not cold so much as patient. He dug deeper, 3 feet down, then more where the slope allowed. Earth piled against the steel walls, insulating them, anchoring them. Shadow watched from the edge, sometimes barking sharply when strangers lingered too long, sometimes sitting quietly, tail wrapped around his paws, eyes never leaving his handler. Inside, Thomas hauled stone. Limestone from the creek bed, field rock cracked by frost, heavy pieces that tore at his gloves and bruised his shins. He stacked them carefully along the inner curve of the shelter, knee-high, shoulder-wide, forming a continuous ring. Each stone was placed with intention. He spoke to none of the onlookers. His jaw tightened when the laughter grew louder, but he did not stop. At night, when the wind howled and the unfinished structure groaned softly, Thomas sat beside Shadow on a crate and listened. Doubt crept in during those hours, subtle and corrosive. He was older now, slower. His pension barely covered food and fuel. If he was wrong, there would be no second attempt. Winter here did not forgive experiments. Shadow sensed the tension. He rested his head on Thomas's boot, warm and solid, grounding him. Thomas scratched behind the dog's ears, fingers sinking into thick fur, and reminded himself why he had survived when others hadn't. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He prepared. By late November, the structure stood complete enough to move into. Inside, it smelled of earth, iron, and pine boards salvaged from an old barn, set a few inches away from the steel to create dead airspace. Straw and sawdust filled the gap, packed loosely, imperfectly. A small cast-iron stove sat at the center, its flue rising straight through the curved roof. It looked inadequate, almost laughable. The first snowfall came early that year, thick, wet flakes that clung to everything, muting sound, hiding flaws. The laughter continued. At the general store, a woman named Linda Carter, thin and sharp-faced, murmured that she hoped the old soldier knew what he was doing. Another man said he'd be gone by Christmas. Thomas moved in quietly, carrying only what he needed. Shadow entered last, sniffed the stone ring, circled once, then lay down with a long sigh. The shelter was dim, the light filtered and low, but it was still. The wind passed overhead instead of through him. For the first time since returning, Thomas felt something like control. That night, as the temperature dropped and the lake wind screamed outside, he lit the stove and watched the flames lick the iron slowly. He pressed his palm to the stones, cold, patient, waiting. He understood them. They would take time. So would the town. Outside, the storm built its strength. Inside, a man in a red and black flannel jacket sat with his dog and waited, knowing that survival was never about appearances, only about what held when everything else failed. Thomas Walker did not argue, not because he lacked words, but because he had learned long ago that explanation wasted energy better spent on preparation. Winter in Marquette was not a debate. It was a fact, as solid and indifferent as the iron-gray surface of Lake Superior. Each morning before dawn, when the sky was still the color of old bruises, Thomas pulled on his thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, stiff with frost along the seams, and stepped outside into the wind. Shadow followed without command, his breath puffing in short white bursts, paws crunching across frozen soil, as if he understood that this work mattered more than comfort. Thomas dug deeper into the earth, widening the shallow bowl he had started weeks earlier. His shovel struck layers of stubborn clay and stone, the kind that rang through his arms and into his shoulders. He worked methodically, not fast, not slow, conserving strength the way he had been taught decades ago on remote airstrips where machines froze solid if men rushed and made mistakes. His body remembered that rhythm even when his joints protested. He leaned into the shovel, lifted, turned, and placed the earth carefully against the curved metal walls, packing it tight with the back of the blade. Soil became armor, not against bullets, but against wind and cold that never slept. Shadow stayed close, sometimes digging beside him with earnest enthusiasm, sometimes standing watch at the tree line. The German shepherd's coat had thickened as winter settled in, the gray-black fur dense and weatherproof, his amber eyes sharp with alertness. At 6 years old, Shadow carried the quiet confidence of a dog that had seen chaos and survived it. When strangers wandered too near, drawn by curiosity or mockery, he rose slowly, tail low but stiff, gaze fixed, a silent warning that this land was claimed. Stone came next. Thomas hauled it piece by piece from the creek bed half a mile away, using a battered sled he had repaired himself. The stones were irregular, cold to the touch, some smooth and pale, others dark and jagged. Each load took longer than the last, his breath burning in his chest, sweat freezing along his collar. He stacked them along the inside curve of the shelter, forming a thick ring that hugged the metal skin from within. It was tedious work, heavy and slow, but Thomas trusted slowness. Heat, he knew, respected patience. As he worked, memories surfaced uninvited. Alaska, a frozen runway at dawn, engines locked solid, oil like tar. Men panicked, cursed, burned fuel uselessly. Thomas had learned then that you didn't fight cold with force. You trapped warmth and gave it time to spread. Engine blankets, insulated pits, heat-soaked techniques that let metal remember warmth instead of surrendering it instantly. The principle was simple, almost dull, and that was why it worked. Nature did not reward cleverness. It rewarded understanding. From town, laughter continued to drift on the wind. One afternoon, a man named Carl Jensen wandered over, pretending interest. Carl was tall and wiry, with a narrow face and pale hair that never seemed to lie flat beneath his wool cap. He had lost 2 fingers to a sawmill accident years back, which had left him bitter and sharp-tongued. "You building a bunker or a grave?" he asked, glancing at the growing wall of stone. Thomas didn't look up. Shadow did. Carl shifted his weight, muttered something under his breath, and left. Not all attention was hostile. A woman named Sarah Collins stopped by one morning, carrying a thermos of coffee she offered without comment. She was in her early 40s, tall and slender, with dark hair pulled into a practical braid and skin weathered by years of work outdoors. Her eyes were observant, thoughtful, the kind that missed little. She owned a small bait shop near the harbor and had grown up watching men boast about winter while quietly losing fingers to frostbite. "My father used stone under our old house," she said simply. "Held heat better than wood alone." Thomas nodded once in acknowledgement. She smiled faintly and left him to his work. Inside the shelter, changes slowly took shape. Thomas lined the inner walls with salvaged barnwood, spacing it carefully from the steel ribs. The boards were rough, scarred by age, smelling faintly of hay and oil. Between wood and metal, he packed straw and sawdust, not tight, not compressed, but loose enough to trap air. Dead air was the cheapest insulation there was. Shadow watched from the dirt floor, occasionally shifting when sawdust tickled his nose. The stove came last. It was small, cast iron, nothing impressive, the kind of thing men bought to heat sheds or workshops. Thomas set it at the center, venting it straight up through the curve of the roof. Neighbors shook their heads harder at that. A stove that small wouldn't heat a kitchen, let alone a metal shelter. Thomas said nothing. He wasn't planning to heat air. Air was fickle, impatient. Stone was loyal. As November deepened, the temperature fell steadily. Nights dipped below zero. Frost crept across the ground in elaborate white patterns. Inside, the stones were still cold, stubbornly so. Thomas fed the stove every evening, watching flames lick iron, feeling heat rise briefly before fading. Doubt returned in the quiet hours, pressing in from the edges of his mind. He ran calculations he had learned by instinct, not numbers but sensations. The stones were warming, slowly, too slowly, perhaps. He pressed his palm against them each night. Cold, then cool, then finally a faint, almost imagined warmth. Shadow sensed the tension. He followed Thomas from task to task, leaned against his legs when he stopped moving, whined softly when the wind howled loudest. Once, during a particularly bitter night, Thomas woke to Shadow growling low, hackles raised. A shape moved outside, just beyond the glow of the stove light. Thomas reached for the old service knife he still kept near his bed. It was only Howard Miller, drunk and curious, stumbling close before Shadow's presence sobered him. "Just checking you ain't froze solid," Howard muttered. Thomas said nothing. The door closed. The wind resumed its song. By the end of November, the shelter felt different. Not warm, not yet, but stable. The cold no longer rushed in the moment the fire died down. It lingered at the edges, respectful, as if waiting its turn. Thomas noticed he slept longer between stoking the stove. He noticed Shadow stretched out on the stone ring instead of curling tight against the cold dirt. These were small signs, easy to dismiss, but Thomas did not dismiss them. One evening, as snow fell thick and silent, Thomas sat on a crate, back against the stone, and closed his eyes. The rock behind him held warmth, subtle but undeniable. He thought of the men who had laughed, of the town that measured intelligence by tradition, of winters that had claimed lives quietly, while people argued about appearances. He felt no anger, only a calm resolve. If this worked, it would work because physics did not care about pride. Outside, Marquette braced for deeper cold. Inside the half-buried shelter, an old soldier and his dog listened to the wind, surrounded by stone and earth that were finally beginning to remember warmth. Winter had not yet shown its worst face, but the foundation of survival was set, patient and unyielding, waiting for the storm to make its next move. December settled over Marquette without ceremony, snow erasing the last traces of autumn as if the season had never existed. The lake wind hardened, sharper now, carrying fine needles of ice that stung exposed skin and found every weakness in walls and seams. The town moved inward, shutters closing, woodpiles shrinking. Winter was no longer a threat. It was present, breathing down every chimney. Inside the half-buried metal shelter, the warmth was modest. Not cold, but not the miracle Thomas Walker had imagined during long nights of planning. The thermometer hovered stubbornly in the low 50s during the day, slipping into the high 40s by morning. It was survivable, barely, but it demanded discipline. Thomas fed the stove at measured intervals, never overloading it, never letting it go completely dark. The stones along the inner wall absorbed heat reluctantly, as if testing him, asking whether he had the patience to see this through. He sat most evenings on the low crate beside the stove, his back against the stone ring, red and black flannel pulled tight across his chest. The jacket smelled faintly of smoke now, a scent that clung to him like memory. Shadow lay stretched along the stone bench, long body relaxed, but ears twitching at every sound outside. The dog had learned the rhythms of this place quickly, when the wind meant nothing, when footsteps meant trouble, when silence meant snow. Doubt crept in quietly, the way cold did, not as panic, but as erosion. Thomas had known doubt before. In war, doubt could kill faster than bullets. Here it gnawed at him differently. He questioned his calculations, his assumptions, his own aging body. He pressed his palm against the stone each night, feeling for progress. Sometimes it felt warmer. Sometimes he wasn't sure if that was real or hope masquerading as sensation. Outside, the town talked. At the lumberyard, men leaned against stacks of pine and made bets. Christmas, New Year's. Someone said he'd be gone before the lake froze solid. Howard Miller laughed louder than most, though his laughter carried an edge now, less confident than before. He'd noticed the smoke rising from Thomas's chimney every evening, steady and thin, not the desperate black plume of a man burning too much too fast. Sarah Collins stopped by again one afternoon, boots crunching over fresh snow. She wore a long wool coat belted tight, her dark braid tucked beneath a knit cap. She didn't comment on the temperature. She simply stood inside for a moment, eyes moving, noticing details, the stone, the earth berm, the way the air felt heavier, calmer. "It's not losing heat fast," she said quietly. Thomas nodded. That was the point. She left without offering encouragement, which somehow meant more. A new face appeared just before Christmas. His name was Mark Ellison, a young man in his late 20s, recently hired as a junior reporter for the local paper. He was tall and narrow-shouldered, with pale skin and glasses that fogged instantly when he stepped inside from the cold. His coat was too thin for Marquette, city-bought and optimistic. He asked polite questions, scribbled notes, glanced skeptically at the small stove. "People are curious," he said. "Some think you're either brilliant or reckless." Thomas replied with a shrug. "Cold doesn't care which one you are." The days shortened further. Snow fell heavier. The stones warmed slowly, maddeningly slowly. Thomas marked time not by dates, but by sensations. How long the warmth lingered after the fire died down. How often shadow chose the stone over the dirt floor. How little frost formed near the walls compared to the ceiling. These were small victories, invisible to anyone not looking for them. Christmas came and went quietly. No visitors, no carols, just the wind and the low crackle of fire. Thomas cooked a simple meal, shared bits with Shadow, and thought about years when holidays had been louder, messier, filled with men who were now names etched into metal. He felt the weight of survival pressing on him, not just his own, but the stubborn desire to prove that preparation could still outmatch tradition. After Christmas, the cold sharpened further. Nighttime temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there. Thomas noticed something change then. The stones no longer cooled completely overnight. By morning, they were still faintly warm, like embers buried under ash. The stove required less wood to bring the space back to comfort. Shadow slept longer, deeper, no longer curling tight, but sprawled openly, belly exposed to the air. Still, doubt lingered. One night, as the wind roared hard enough to make the shelter hum, Thomas woke suddenly, heart racing. For a moment, he was back on a frozen runway, alarms screaming, engines failing. He sat up, breathing hard, hand gripping the edge of the crate. Shadow was instantly alert, head lifted, eyes fixed on him. Thomas rested his forehead against the dog's thick neck, grounding himself in the present. The shelter held. The walls did not bleed heat. The earth did not betray him. Outside, a group of men passed by, laughter carrying through the trees. Someone shouted, "See you in town soon, old man." Thomas did not respond. He added one more log to the stove, then none after that, deliberately. He wanted to see what would happen. Hours passed. The fire died down to glowing coals. The air cooled slightly, but not sharply. The stones gave back what they had taken. By New Year's Eve, the bets had shifted. No one said it out loud, but curiosity replaced certainty. Smoke still rose from the metal shelter. No for sale sign appeared. No abandoned tracks led away from the trees. Mark Ellison returned once more, stayed longer this time. His skepticism dulled by the simple fact that Thomas Walker was still there. On the last night of the year, snow fell thick and heavy, muffling the world. Thomas sat in silence, listening to the wind scrape over the buried roof, feeling the steady warmth radiating from the stone into his back. He thought of the months ahead, of colder days yet to come, of January looming like a final exam. His faith was no longer blind, but it was not yet complete. It wavered, steadied, wavered again. Shadow lifted his head and looked at him, amber eyes calm, unafraid. Thomas exhaled slowly. Winter had arrived, and with it the test he had been preparing for. Whether he had been right or wrong would soon be decided, not by laughter, not by opinion, but by numbers etched in frost and breath. January arrived without warning, as if winter had grown tired of patience and decided to reveal its true face all at once. The temperature fell through the night, sinking past every familiar marker until numbers lost meaning and only sensation remained. By midnight, it was minus 34 degrees Celsius, and the wind off Lake Superior screamed like something alive, slamming into walls, clawing at roofs, probing every weakness it could find. Snow no longer drifted gently. It flew sideways, dense and punishing, scraping exposed skin raw in seconds. Across Marquette, lights burned late. Chimneys belched thick black smoke as families fed their stoves without pause. Log cabins that had stood for generations groaned and cracked as wood contracted under the cold. Inside those homes, men slept in layers of wool and coats, boots left on, hats pulled low. Children whimpered in their sleep. Water froze in pipes despite constant dripping. The cold was no longer an inconvenience, it was an adversary. In the half-buried metal shelter at the edge of the pines, Thomas Walker stood quietly, listening. The wind thundered overhead, but inside the sound was muted, filtered through earth and stone. He fed the stove one last time just after sunset, placing the logs carefully, letting the fire catch slowly rather than flare. Then he closed the iron door and sat back, his red and black flannel jacket heavy on his shoulders, watching the flames settle into a steady, disciplined burn. Shadow paced once, twice, then lay down along the stone ring, his long body stretched out, paws extended, breath slow and even. The German shepherd's coat rose and fell rhythmically, unconcerned by the chaos outside. That alone told Thomas more than any thermometer could. He did not add more wood when the flames died down to glowing coals. That was the test, the moment he had been preparing for since November. He leaned back against the stone, feeling its warmth seep through the fabric of his jacket. Not hot, not urgent, but present. The stones had finally learned their role. They remembered. Sleep came in fragments. Thomas woke occasionally, instinctively, checking the stove, the walls, the sound of the wind. Each time the shelter held. No sharp drops in temperature. No icy breath fogging the air near his face. The earth wrapped around the structure like a clenched fist, shielding it from the worst of the storm. Just before dawn, there was a knock. Not loud, hesitant, as if the person on the other side wasn't entirely sure what they expected to find. Shadow's head lifted instantly, ears forward, a low rumble forming in his chest. Thomas stood, joints stiff, knife already in his hand, before his mind caught up. He opened the door slowly. Howard Miller stood there, his beard frosted white, eyes wide. He looked smaller somehow, hunched inside his heavy coat, cheeks red and cracked from the cold. Behind him, the wind howled, tearing at his words. I had to see, he said, voice rough. Thought maybe you'd... He stopped mid-sentence as warm air rolled out around him, fogging his eyelashes. Howard stepped inside, boots crunching on packed dirt, and froze not from cold, but disbelief. The shelter was warm, not tolerable. Warm. The air wrapped around him, heavy and still. He took off his gloves slowly, flexed his fingers. Jesus, he muttered. His gaze moved to the stone ring, to the stove with its dead coals, to Shadow stretched out like a king by the wall. You been feeding that thing all night? Thomas shook his head. Once, at sunset. He gestured to the thermometer hanging from a rib of steel. The mercury hovered between 66 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the wind chill pushed past -40. Howard stared, mouth slightly open. He touched the stone with bare fingers, expecting surface warmth only. Instead, the heat went deeper, soaking into his skin. It's like a damn battery, he whispered. Thomas said nothing. He didn't need to. Word spread fast in a town locked indoors by fear. By mid-morning, 2 more men arrived, then another. Carl Jensen showed up, missing fingers tucked awkwardly into his sleeves, his sharp tongue conspicuously absent. He stood near the doorway, eyes darting, uncomfortable with the idea that something he had mocked might have outperformed everything he trusted. Mark Ellison arrived with his notebook forgotten in his coat pocket, glasses fogging as soon as he stepped inside. He stayed quiet, absorbing the scene, skepticism draining from his posture. Sarah Collins came last. Snow clung to her coat, her braids stiff with ice. She stepped in, closed the door behind her, and simply stood there, eyes half closed, feeling the air. "It held," she said softly, more statement than question. Thomas nodded. Her lips curved into a small, satisfied smile. Outside, the town struggled. Pipes burst, engines failed. A delivery truck jackknifed near the harbor road and sat abandoned, engine dead, doors frozen shut. Inside the metal shelter, time slowed. The stones continued their quiet work, releasing warmth hour after hour, indifferent to the panic beyond the walls. Howard stayed longer than anyone else, sitting awkwardly on a crate, staring at the thermometer as if it might lie. "I burned through half my woodpile last night," he said finally, "and my place still dropped below 50. He looked at Thomas, something like humility in his eyes. "You were right." Thomas felt no triumph, only relief, the kind that loosened a knot he hadn't realized was there. He looked down at Shadow, who opened one eye lazily, tail thumping once against the dirt. "It's not about being right," Thomas said. "It's about staying alive." By afternoon, the cold began to ease slightly, though it remained brutal. People returned to their homes with new stories, new doubts. The laughter that had followed Thomas's project for months vanished, replaced by silence and calculation. Men who had sworn by tradition now replayed the night in their minds, measuring heat, wood, survival. As dusk fell again, Thomas closed the door, shutting out the world. He added a modest amount of wood to the stove, more out of habit than necessity. The shelter glowed with stored warmth. Outside, the cold retreated grudgingly, leaving behind a town that would never quite look at the half-buried metal structure the same way again. The coldest night on record had passed, and it had not claimed him. The morning after the coldest night did not bring relief so much as revelation. The wind eased its grip on Marquette, but the temperature remained brutal, a steady reminder of what the town had narrowly endured. Smoke still rose from chimneys, though thinner now, as if people were afraid to admit how much fuel they had already burned. What changed was the direction of footsteps. They no longer circled away from the half-buried metal shelter at the edge of the pines. They moved toward it. Thomas Walker woke to the sound of boots on frozen ground, and voices carried low, cautious, stripped of humor. He pulled on his red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket and stepped outside with Shadow at his side. The German shepherd stood tall, alert but calm, tail low and steady, reading the crowd with practiced ease. Men and women stood there. Some he recognized, others he did not, all wearing the same expression, curiosity edged with humility. Howard Miller was there again, his broad frame wrapped in layers, beard neatly trimmed this time as if he had made an effort. He nodded at Thomas, no joke following. Sarah Collins stood a little apart, hands in her pockets, eyes attentive. Mark Ellison hovered near the back, notebook open now, pencil already moving. With him was an older man Thomas had not seen before, thin and stooped, with steel-gray hair and a long wool coat that spoke of habit rather than warmth. The man introduced himself as Daniel Pierce, a retired civil engineer who had moved to Marquette years earlier to be closer to his grandchildren. He was tall but fragile-looking, his face deeply lined, eyes sharp behind thick lenses. "I spent 40 years telling people what wouldn't work," Daniel said, voice dry. "Figured it was time I saw something that did." He stepped inside without waiting for permission. One by one they followed. The shelter received them without ceremony. Warm air settled around their shoulders. Breath slowed. Gloves came off. Someone laughed once, softly, in disbelief, then stopped as if embarrassed by the sound. Daniel Pierce knelt with difficulty, pressing his palm flat against the stone ring. He held it there longer than anyone else, eyes closed, counting seconds. When he stood, his expression had changed. "It's not surface heat," he said quietly. "It's stored." They measured. Mark fetched a thermometer from his car, digital and precise. It stabilized at 67 degrees Fahrenheit. Daniel took notes, asking Thomas simple questions about wood usage, stove size, timing. Thomas answered without flourish. Once in the evening, small fire. Let it die. The stones did the rest. Daniel nodded slowly, as if confirming a suspicion he had held for decades, but never seen proven so plainly. Outside, more people arrived. Carl Jensen lingered near the door, face tight, hands shoved deep into his sleeves. He did not enter. He did not leave either. Others paced around the structure, studying the earth berm, the slope, the way snow piled unevenly against the metal. Someone tapped the steel with gloved fingers and shook his head. "Shouldn't work," he muttered. No one laughed. By midday, the shelter had become a quiet classroom. Questions replaced jokes. How deep? What kind of stone? How thick the earth? Thomas answered patiently, but he did not teach. He described. There was a difference. He did not tell anyone what to do, only what he had done and why. Shadow moved among the visitors, accepting a cautious pat here and there, ever watchful, ever present. In the days that followed, Marquette changed its rhythm. Shovels appeared where there had been snowbanks. Men who had once boasted about tradition now measured ground depth and collected stone from frozen creeks. Not all copied Thomas's design exactly. Some adapted it to log cabins, adding stone benches along interior walls. Others dug partial basements, piling earth against the north sides of their homes. The principle spread quietly, without announcement, driven by memory of a night none of them wished to repeat. Mark Ellison's article ran the following Sunday. He did not call Thomas a genius. He did not call him reckless. He wrote about numbers, temperatures, wood consumption, facts that refused to bend to opinion. The headline was plain. The town read it anyway. Daniel Pierce submitted a letter to the editor the next week, explaining thermal mass in careful language, ending with a sentence that stuck. Nature does not reward tradition. It rewards understanding. Thomas watched all of this from a distance. He did not attend meetings. He did not stand beside shovels or give instructions. When asked why he didn't charge for advice, he shrugged. "I didn't invent heat," he said once, adjusting his jacket as the wind picked up. "I just stopped wasting it." Sarah Collins stopped by one evening with coffee and a quiet smile. She sat on a crate, boots steaming gently as they dried. "People listen now," she said. Thomas nodded. "They'll forget too," he replied. She considered that, then shook her head. "Not this winter." Shadow lay at Thomas's feet, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed. The dog had become something of a symbol himself. Children pointed him out from passing cars. Someone left a bag of treats by the door without explanation. Shadow accepted the attention with the same calm dignity he brought to everything else. As January stretched on, the cold returned in waves, but the shelter held. Thomas burned less wood than anyone expected, less than he himself had planned for. The stone ring grew warmer, steadier, a quiet presence that transformed harsh nights into something survivable. He slept better. The old tension in his chest eased. Survival no longer felt like defiance. It felt like balance. One afternoon, Carl Jensen finally stepped inside. He stood near the door, eyes darting, jaw tight. He did not apologize. He did not need to. He touched the stone once, nodded, and left. The door closed behind him, laughter permanently absent from his step. By the end of winter, Marquette bore subtle scars, burst pipes repaired, roofs patched, but something else had shifted beneath the surface. People spoke differently about cold now, with respect, with curiosity, with less certainty. The half-buried metal shelter remained at the edge of town, unchanged in appearance, still ugly to some eyes, still strange. But it was no longer ridiculous. One evening, as snow melted into slush and the lake wind softened, Thomas sat outside with Shadow, watching the sky darken. He thought of the months past, of doubt and preparation, of laughter that had once cut sharper than cold. He felt no satisfaction in being proven right, only a quiet affirmation that the world, when listened to carefully, explained itself. Shadow lifted his head and let out a single soft bark, as if punctuating the thought. In the heart of a Michigan winter, the town had relearned an old lesson. Truth did not need to be beautiful. It only needed to hold. And maybe that is the quiet miracle hidden in this story. Not the metal, not the stone, not even the warmth that defied the cold. The miracle was this. When a man stopped fighting the storm and instead worked with the laws God placed into the world, survival followed. God did not part the snow or silence the wind, but he gave wisdom, patience, and understanding. And sometimes, that is how miracles arrive. In our daily lives, we often pray for the cold to disappear. But sometimes, God teaches us how to endure it instead, through preparation, through humility, through listening instead of arguing, through faith that works quietly, steadily, faithfully, just like those stones holding warmth through the night. If you're facing a season that feels cold right now, financially, emotionally, spiritually, remember this. You don't always need more fire. Sometimes, you just need to learn how to hold what warmth you already have. If this story spoke to you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We read every one, and it reminds us how far these stories travel. And if you believe that wisdom, faith, and real-life stories still matter, consider subscribing to the channel. It truly helps more people find these messages. May God bless you, protect you, and keep you warm in your home, in your heart, and in every storm you face. Amen.